turn your computer off, you can.
Let's see. And if everyone could mute themselves, that would be
Yeah,
awesome.
I gotta mute.
Great. So I just want to welcome you to COVID-19 1 year later. I'm Addie Smith-Ryman, the Executive Director of the Portland Society for Architecture. This is our third installment of our series with our partners AIA Maine, and Jeanette Schramm is on the call, Gretchen Rabinkin, who is the Executive Director of the Boston Society for Landscape Architecture, and also Lisa Whitehead from Workplace Transformation Facilitation, and Stephanie Brock of Red Thread. We have spent the last year listening and learning from our community about their experiences and expectations for returning back to work. Can you actually all see the participant list? Is that coming up? It is, isn't it? We have spent the last year listening and learning from our community about their experience and expectations for returning to shared spaces and places. And we continue to delve deeper into how we can rebuild our places and spaces to be safe and healthy and equitable for all. Dr. Sara Jensen Carr is the third lecture of this series. Next week on the 26th, we have a discussion, a conversation with local historians, the stewards of the archives of our built space, giving a history on Portland's downtown development. It will be exceptionally rich. And I'm really grateful. The series has been phenomenal. It will be recorded and accessible really within 24 to 48 hours. So you can check on our YouTube channel. And I also just want to take a moment now as we talk about rebuilding our places and spaces to be safe, healthy, and equitable for all. I want us to pause in remembrance and pay respect to the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy in Maine, and of our featured speaker here, speaking to you from her home south of Boston, which is the occupied territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts tribes. With respect for the traditions of these Indigenous people, we affirm their inherent sovereignty in this territory and are hopeful for healing. With this, we will commit to the ongoing work of decolonization. Sara, it is an honor to welcome you. You are fairly new to our region, and we're excited to have you. I wish we could have you in person, and I look forward to that day that we can. You are a licensed and practicing architect, trained in landscape architecture, a researcher, and an educator. And it's really fabulous to glean from your perspective the tangible and intangible that really lends itself to the construct of our American cities and just our places in general. I would add that this complements the upcoming launch of your book, the title of today's talk, actually, that's coming out later this spring. I look forward to getting my hands on a copy. And it's also worth mentioning that Sara's affiliation with Northeastern is really exciting. As the Roos Centers here in Portland, we both, our partners, AIA, BSLA, PSA, are all really excited about the potential of partnerships and opportunities with your department for future studios. So this is really an extraordinary. So I'm going to go through the slides here. That's it. I also wanted to see, some folks are here. And without further ado, I would love to encourage everyone to turn their screen off and mute yourself, especially if you're eating lunch. And the best view actually is to go to speaker view, and then Sara can share her screen. And then we will open it up for questions. There are a number of folks on this call, so one of the best things to do is actually type your, just put in the chat that you'd like to speak, and then we can open that up. And Sara, are you able to speak? Is that?
I think so, yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, perfect, brilliant.
Yeah, okay. Great. I'm reconciling myself to Zoom live and actually just got a microphone. It's finally like a real microphone last week. So hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. So thank you, Addie, so much for hosting me today. Thank you everybody for attending. Also, thank you to BSLA, which I am a proud member of for co-sponsoring this talk today. as Addie mentioned, I am a professor at Northeastern University. I live just a little bit south of Boston, and I was very excited to talk to you all today. As you know, we in the Northeastern University School of Architecture are thinking about how to be, especially in the architecture school, thinking about how to be um, more porous to the communities that we live in, which is, of course, our university is right near Roxbury, for those of you that know Boston, but of course now this also extends to Portland as well. And so I hope to be seeing many of you in person in the near future. So Addie gave a little bit of my background, but I just wanted to, I'll give a little bit more biography before I get into the talk today, about what drove me to this research, and really the crux of what I teach at Northeastern University, and also all of my work. And that is this question: how does the design of buildings, landscapes, and the public realm heal or harm us? And this very much comes from my professional background. When I first got out of architecture school, I actually worked in the healthcare institution realm. So I was, working on operating rooms, maternity wards, inpatient psychiatric units. So I became very much enmeshed with evidence-based design, which those of you that may also be in healthcare design are familiar with. But all this research looking at sort of the really direct relationships between environments of healing and outcomes. Now, the other part of this story is, at this time, I was actually working in New Orleans. Many of our clients were in the Gulf South, and I was there in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit. So like most, I evacuated. Like fewer, I had the privilege to come back when many didn't have that same privilege. And my life was really consumed with the recovery for some time. I was doing FEMA surveys. We were rehabilitating client buildings. I was going to community planning meetings. And so in the absence of hospitals online at the time, I started to think about what are the effects of landscape on our health, and how does landscape work as healthcare infrastructure? And that's what led me really to the beginning of the journey that has brought me here today to talk to you. I ended up going to UC Berkeley to get my MLA, and then staying on to get a PhD in environmental planning, really all examining this question and bringing in my background in healthcare design as well, and trying to figure out how to mesh all of them. So I think when I started the program, I was thinking, very naively that, oh, maybe I could come up with some, something similar to the AIA, AAH guidelines for healthcare facilities, but for landscape, right? That's what I went in thinking. Even so, though, I had already seen in New Orleans how landscape could be wielded to displace people in the name of well-being and safety. In particular, this type of unspecified top-down green space that we often see in vision plans. You may not be familiar with this, but this is the infamous green dot map, which was released by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission after Hurricane Katrina. And it very much widely deemed low-lying areas to be raised for parks that could flood. Now, yes, objectively, this is a good aim, right? To not build where people are in danger. But you have to realize it was extremely discomforting for anybody that lived there, especially those that lived within those green circles, which didn't follow the lines of the actual built environment that were there and were not drawn in regards to neighborhood character or demographics. So while I did, and I still do strongly believe in the power of urban landscapes in addressing health, I did come in somewhat skeptical of how those conversations were framed. And so I'm not a historian. I come to this from practice, like many of you, but when I was writing my dissertation, I really wanted to understand how our present day landscape shapes our health, but also how it got to be that way. And my book was essentially one chapter in my dissertation that I really wanted to expand. But again, I wasn't a historian. My dissertation was actually based on walkable neighborhoods and forms of walkable neighborhoods. But I've been so lucky to be able to expand it into this book, which, as Addie mentioned, is coming out in July from University of Virginia Press. I will say, as someone who's been looking at how health and disease have formed the urban landscape for a decade now, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what the COVID-19 pandemic means. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And while I don't have any predictions about the future right now, what I will be talking about today is how the history of American epidemics got us to the landscape that we currently inhabit, and maybe what we could keep in mind at this inflection point in time. So we probably all instinctually know that the places we live are inextricably tied to our health. Modern day diseases, though, are a very complicated knot of genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors. In 2016, Karen DeSalvo, the interim secretary of the US Department of Health and Human Services, noted that public health had entered a new era where one's zip code is a better indicator of health than genetic code. And so when I started this exploration, I wanted to know, how did we move from the conception of an unhealthy environment being a densely populated urban center, like you see on the left, and how it was conceived through much of the 20th century, to now where we see, more car-centric suburban and exurban environments decried by many planners and public health researchers as unhealthy today. And again, when we talk about inflection points, this may all change with some of the documented moves of people from the city to the suburbs as well. But prior to this current pandemic, what we saw is a shift over the past 150 years in what was considered a healthy or unhealthy environment. And we can see it in a lot of the literature at the time, right? From the 60s to the 70s, even to the 90s, when this book was written by Mike Davis, we read about 6 cities and Victor Gruen's, urban crisis, the diagnosis of the urban crisis, finally culminating in Mike Davis's Dead Cities. But more recently, we see more titles like this: The Happy City, Making Healthy Places, Greener, Healthier Cities. So what changed? And definitely one thing that changed is the types of illnesses that we're dealing with, but also how we understand the connection between external environments and our own bodies. So to posit something broadly, if we look at the history of health in the built environment, I would say that in response to epidemics, we have often designed our environments to control, in this order, miasma, germs, and behavior. So miasma, a term which may not be familiar to us now, but will come back into play in the end when we talk about COVID-19. But miasma theory is the idea that just by inhaling, marsh gases or polluted air, that you could get sick. And this concept dates back to Hippocrates, 400 BC, when he wrote On Airs, Waters, and Places, which really was the first to connect the health of the environment to the health of those that inhabit it. His writings would talk about the difference between wholesome and unwholesome waters, talking about the latter being marshy and stagnant, and describing the people that lived near low-lying waters as being very ill as well. Miasma theory had wide acceptance well into the 20th century, especially as it began to associate tangibly foul air and water to airborne disease. And it very much makes sense if you think about the condition of cities in the late 1800s and even early 1900s. The first movement connecting the built environment to population health outcomes correlates with the beginning of American urban history during the Industrial Revolution. So as factories and workforce populations grew in city centers, so did the amount of waste and sewage dumped in the streets. Slaughterhouses were often still inside city limits, there was no municipal sanitation, and air pollution was rampant. Many housing units lacked indoor plumbing or sufficient light and fresh air, and there were massive outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever, requiring coordinated action between planners, engineers, public health officials, architects, and doctors in these fields. Of particular concern were crowded tenements, and this cartoon, featured in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1865, was entitled "The Tenement Houses of New York, How the Poor Live in Crowded Cities, How Pestilence is Generated, How the Parents are Demoralized and Their Children Depraved, the Great Source of Destitution and Crime." Social scientists, who were just beginning to explore the connections between environment and behavior, pointed to physical density as a risk factor for what they called moral contagion, as well as disease spread. And so the urgency of cholera, and if you think about cholera and also yellow fever, it could kill within a few days. You could really be fine a couple days before, but once you ingested the bacteria, and cholera was indeed waterborne, it was not in the air as many believe, but it took some time for that to take hold. It was extremely terrifying. And so people were associating the generalized urban condition of cities at the time with cholera. So here we can see a cholera envisioned as a skeleton that's telling a landlord of a tenement that he is about to occupy the premises. And tenements were routinely described as perpetual fever nests by New York's sanitary inspectors in their surveys of the city. And so to combat this, the biggest changes to our cities that came from health came from this massive sanitary infrastructure movement in the United States that came as a result of cholera and yellow fever, and also what we termed filth diseases. So it was during the late 1800s and early 1900s that many combined sewage, wastewater, and straight runoff systems, many of which we have still in operation today, definitely in Boston, but also New York City, San Francisco, and others. This is the time when they were installed in cities. Our naturally open waterways were where workers also camped out by and were used as waste conveyance, were otherwise contained in underground culverts and paved over. Excuse me. Sorry, sneeze. Marshlands were filled in, and not only to get rid of those miasmic gases, but to accommodate industrial expansion as well. The outfall of these waste systems were often still in open water bodies, but at least it was moved out of the city. And many subscribe to the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution. And although a significant body of scientists and doctors did not believe the disease was spread through air, in fact, they knew rightfully that it was waterborne and had to be ingested. What this really kicked off was a multi-pronged strategy of personal and municipal sanitation, alleviating density and remaking or removing industry and worker housing, and in the end, radically remade the haphazard landscape of American cities. So you can see some of the changes here. The June 22nd, 1895 edition of Harper's Weekly compared photos of the same street corners 2 years earlier to show what incredible transformation street cleaning had affected. Waste infrastructure really configured the streets of our cities because they had to be longer, straighter, and wider to accommodate these pipes. Some even thought that cobblestones were thought to hold miasmic gases between them, and so in many cities they were switched out for smooth pavement that could be washed down at the end of the day. And while our cities were being replanned, many were also looking to Europe to see how they had controlled their own cholera epidemics. So not just for an example of massive underground waste infrastructure, but also thinking about the sort of theoretical underpinnings of urban planning at the time. Historian Richard Sennett, in his book Flesh and Stone, talked about how many 18th and 19th century European cities prioritized circulation and movement via their street networks in the wake of physician William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. So dirt and grime in the streets were thought to clog healthy airs that could run throughout the city, and palaces and places of commerce acted as hearts that powered movement, and one-way streets were employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the directionality of veins and arteries. And perhaps we can see this most clearly, this inspiration in Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago. But also, once streets and sanitary infrastructure were transformed, American cities also turned to parks as a way to breathe fresh air into cities. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, was actually also the executive secretary of the US Sanitary Commission and had a background in public health. And his time there convinced him that density and slum conditions were the root causes of disease, and disease carried through water and the atmosphere. So Central Park, like many of his other plans, leveraged fear about the detrimental health effects of diseases to advocate for the health benefits of green space, from providing a mental health respite from the business of the city to the supposed filtering effects of trees on bad airs. And of course, we can see how forward-thinking Frederick Law Olmsted was in many of his designs in describing what we might term as ecosystem services today. In his book on public parks and the enlargement of towns, written in 1870, he wrote, "Air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vitiated air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees, and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity toward other men. And so he's not just talking about the mechanical cleaning effect of landscape, but he's also talking about the importance of having parks in cities to supply mental health benefits. And again, this is all things that we know through empirical evidence today. And health, specifically the search for fresh air, was in fact a large driver of the move to Western cities like Phoenix and Denver, which grew significantly by specifically recruiting asthmatics. Dr. Charles Dennison's Rocky Mountain Health Resorts, written in 1880, advertised Colorado as the Switzerland of the Americas, evoking images of clean mountain air and the generally accepted superior moral values of Europeans. This map by Dennison attempts to show the climatic patterns of Colorado, specifically its dry, cool air. And writing about Colorado Springs, he said, "It is the home also of a cultivated class of people who have been attracted to the state by its health outcomes." It was estimated that up to a quarter of people who settled in Colorado, Arizona, and California in the late 1800s and very early 1900s did so for their health or a family member's health. By 1890, Denver had grown by almost a third, with almost 30,000 people moving there to treat consumption, and this rate of growth would persist for the next 3 decades. However, our commonly accepted ideas of how environment affected health were really upended with the development of vaccines. Once the immediacy of infectious disease abated somewhat, it still didn't stop architects, landscape architects, and planners from exploring the ideas of bodies and cities and landscapes and buildings, albeit in a much more metaphorical way. Knowing that the pandemics of the early 1900s, namely flu and tuberculosis, could be addressed by medicine, density was perhaps no longer an immediate concern, but many were still thinking about how architecture could optimize bodies and health. And although these concepts of health and built environment had become mostly theoretical at this point, earlier ideas about miasma combined with developing building technology and also increasing fears of the street as automobiles started to take them over really pushed a lot of the design ideas of this period. This is Le Corbusier's Radiant City, which was conceived as a vertical garden city, which came from Ebenezer Howard thinking about city and country houses, but really takes it vertical. Corbusier envisioned all social interactions as internal to the building itself. So he was not thinking of the street as a public realm anymore, rather that people would interact in the hallways of these buildings instead. And he also thought he would be liberating his building's residents from this filth or grime. Corbusier's machines for living were intensely focused on what the right measurements were for an individual, and a community would be made simply by producing those units over and over again. In his writings for the hypothetical Radiant City, he would specify that there should be 14 square meters per occupant per apartment, 12 meters of plate glass window to let in exactly the right amount of sunlight. The air would be at 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit all day. There were 8 liters of air to go through the room every minute for what he called exact respiration. That all residents of the Radiant City would not have to walk any more than 100 meters to transport, and that could be elevator or taxi, but also wrote that only above 50 meters above the ground level was pure air access, which still leaves the question of who has to live below the 50-meter mark. And so while Corbusier only has one built work in the United States, we can really see the influence of his writing, and especially the European consortium SIAM, in many public housing units that were built in the mid-century, and these ideas about health transferred to buildings. However, without the context of the European social safety net, many of these ideas that came from SIAM, such as extreme density to keep green space around buildings, reimagining the corridor as a place of social interaction, but very much so also the aesthetic disruption that these buildings created in cities ended up being detrimental to resident health instead, both directly and by stigmatizing them in existing neighborhoods. And these mixed metaphors of bodies and cities were wielded to ruinous ends in terms of urban renewal as well. So in the mid-century, cancer was an epidemic that researchers soon realized could not be conquered by vaccines, even though they tried to pinpoint the cancer germ. In fact, a federally funded early 1960s study attempted to inject hundreds of monkeys with human tumors in a desperate effort to try and come up with a vaccine for cancer, but to no avail. In Susan Sontag's Illnesses Metaphor, written in 1977, she confronted the late 20th century era's preoccupation with cancer by comparing it to the previous TB epidemic, saying, "Now it is cancer's turn to be the disease that doesn't knock before it enters. Cancer that fills the role of an illness, experienced as a ruthless secret invasion, a role it will keep until one day its etiology becomes as clear and its treatment as effective as those of tuberculosis have become." Indeed, it was the unknowability of cancer that made it so terrifying, but it also made it an apt way to communicate the direness of the urban condition and spur action. The concurrent epidemics of urban disinvestment, disintegration, and abandonment, commonly referred to as blight, often leaned on cancer as a metaphor, especially as it appeared to similarly eat cities from the inside out in the form of fire, vice, and crime. Michael Deere wrote that the process of abandonment as it operates in space suggests an initial broad scattering of abandoned structures characterized internally by the occurrence of many small groups of abandoned houses. It is essentially a contagious sequence. Contagion has major implications for our understanding of the dynamics of abandonment and for later policy considerations. And this treatment of blight as a disease extended to its documentation. Much like cholera before it, blighted properties were documented by public health agencies by going from door to door, searching for its vectors of contagion. A 1951 architectural forum advertising slum surgery in St. Louis showed blighted and obsolete districts beginning to encroach on the rest of the city grid, with those districts shaded as if to erase their existing characteristics. And we can see the connection between these blight maps and the way cancer was depicted at the time. This is a still from an educational film in 1953 entitled The Warning Shadow, which used X-ray animations to depict the terrifying growth of a small black dysplasia on a man's lung. This film ends with the patient agreeing to a pneumonectomy or surgical removal of the lung. Eradication by surgery or radium was the preferred treatment of cancer. And architects and planners seized on this treatment as a model for how blight should be treated in cities as well. Many municipal departments, aided by private companies like the RAND Corporation, first attempted what they called immunizations, and that was increased municipal services like fire and police stations and attempts to enforce stricter building codes. But when this failed, they turned toward an urban chemotherapy or the total eradication of clusters of blight. In his book, The City, Its Growth, Its Decay, Its Future, architect and planner Elel Sarnan used a diagram of the disintegration of cells to discuss the disintegration of the fabric of the city and a healthy cell as a model of rebuilding. And he wrote, "The slums he clears by piecemeal mending, and the old infects the new in short order. The planner must know, as well as the doctor, that when the head aches, the stomach might be out of order. And the planner must be aware of the fact, as well as the doctor, that vitality cannot be transfused into a dead organ. The dead organ must be removed and the transfusion affected in a healthy part of the body. He must unearth the roots of evil. He must amputate slums by a decisive surgery, and he must transfuse vitality only into those areas that are protected against contagion." As they had been in the sanitary movement as well, children were invoked as innocent victims in order to further the cause. James W. Fallon, Commissioner of the Urban Renewal Administration, in a talk entitled Slums and Blight, A Disease of Urban Life, showed Gussie, a cartoon depiction of a waif-like young white girl, as proxy for the deadly effect of slums on human lives. She is introduced standing on a pile of rubble, or as the author puts it, adrift on a sea of blight. The book shows a series of maps overlaying juvenile delinquency, lack of sanitation, tuberculosis, and population density, always pointing to the center of the cities. That's a quote from the book. And later, Gussie is shown wielding the gargantuan broom of code enforcement, which you see in the inset here, of health and sanitation to address these issues. And so to address the issue of urban blight, we see urban renewal documents. And even in these two documents, the bottom from New York City and the top from San Francisco, they depict strikingly similar landscapes. sleek, sterile, modern towers on a flat platform of green. And in fact, San Francisco's Jackson Square plan shown above is shown as isolated from any existing fabric, save for City Hall, with no mention of the neighborhood that it replaced, the Fillmore neighborhood, which was a cultural center for the West Coast, small at the time Black population. Indeed, 80% of those removed by urban renewal were Black, and in Baltimore, the number was reported to be 100%. The logic of blight as disease was eradication, erasure, and reoccupation with a healthy graft of anonymous towers and green. And this brings us to our immediate pre-pandemic moment, and probably what many of us were dealing with in our daily profession. And what we can track this to is really the control of behavior to think about these lifestyle diseases of the late 20th and early 21st century, most notably obesity. So the CDC reported that in the United States, the percentage of overweight adults hovered around 31% between 1960 and 1994. And the percentage of adults categorized as obese increased from 13% to 23%, meaning in the mid 1990s, almost 55% of adults in the United States were overweight or obese. Researchers started to draw connections between larger patterns of change in society, which ranged from food availability, but also extended to technological attachment. But a great deal of literature also started to point to sedentary lifestyles, which were encouraged by, or really formed by, unabated suburban growth oriented around the automobile as a driver of the obesity epidemic. And so here we see by the end of the 20th century, the locus of disease would shift from the city to the suburbs. Now, the previous figures notwithstanding, the definition of obesity is still problematic in many respects, from the unreliability of the body mass index and its actual relationship to overall health, to cultural and racial ideals of bodies and diets. Nevertheless, many designers and urban planners saw an opportunity to elevate their practice in the name of public health, but in some cases ended up exacerbating health inequities. And I should point out, though rightly, on a related point, many have also pointed out that this car-centric design that dominates our country today also exacerbates climate change and urban heat island, which also represents a larger existential threat to all of our health. However, one of the movements that arose in response to this unabated car-centered growth were the principles of New Urbanism. Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk were leaders of the movement, as well as the planners and primary architects of Seaside, often seen as the purest distillation of New Urbanist ideals. The New Urbanism movement was based on highly specific urban and architectural codes to build neo-traditional neighborhoods, preoccupied with density formulas, land use, and architectural form of dwelling, with less attention perhaps to the overall landscape, other than ensuring its walkability and that its residents would not have to use cars. In their manifesto, Suburban Nation, published by Duany Plater-Zyberk and Jeff Speck in 2000, the authors made many assertions that were very common sense, especially regarding on how much of the American landscape was only navigable by car. However, when enacting their suggested remedies on the ground, it became almost immediately problematic. In their steadfast belief that the old way of building was best, instead emphasized some of the historical blind spots of building for health in the past. So we can see Duany Plater-Zyberk's urban codes as a prescriptive landscape of sorts if we're talking about remedies, not just to address obesity, but also claiming to improve social cohesion, civic participation, and above all, eliminate cars from the public realm. The early New Urbanists were particularly taken with the regional interpretations of European architecture in the Deep South. Duany and Plater-Zyberk have cited that their inspirations came from a road trip to towns such as Savannah, Charleston, and Natchez, Mississippi, but do not reference the racial, social, or class systems inherent in the different forms of dwelling. Most of all, building to these prescriptive guidelines were difficult to enact within the existing tangle of sprawl and were instead relegated to being built on green fields and far from job centers, and so in many cases only increased it. And now to their credit, I feel like the Congress for New Urbanism has dialed some of the form-centric, the concentration on form back a little bit and are now looking more at place and planning. However, the willingness of governments to invest in the supposedly curative effects of New Urbanism became very apparent when in the mid-1990s, it was adopted as the standard architectural and planning style of public housing under the Clinton administration's Hope 6 development plans. Hope 6 did attempt to take some lessons learned from the disastrous mid-century modernist public housing developments, um, like proposing a scattered site strategy that would strategically infill often slightly higher income neighborhoods with smaller scale single or multifamily housing. But just as in the mid-century, the tactic of adopting a specific aesthetic for public housing, even if neo-traditionalism instead of modernism still served to visually stigmatize those within, while continuing to imply that those living in it would be uplifted and have their morals corrected through architecture and design. And again, while it was mostly a failure of administration, I would say, rather than design, the well-documented effects of displacement that were wrought by the Hope 6 program as old high-density units were torn down to build new ones, but less numerous mid-scale ones, was probably one of the largest detriments to residents' health. Nevertheless, we have and should continue to view the built environment as a treatment for many epidemics. And that extends from the figurative prescription of new urbanism to now literally being prescribed by the US Surgeon General, as seen in this 2015 Step It Up campaign, driven by the US Surgeon General at the time under the Obama administration, Vivek Murthy, who is on the verge of confirmation again under the Biden administration. And so I think it's a boon to our profession to have medical professionals interested in what we do and say that we need walkable neighborhoods. To provide an environment that supports healthy behavior is definitely positive, but we have to think more broadly about how to untangle our most car-centric environments. And keeping in mind, as cities and walkable environments have become more in demand, these ostensibly healthier and greener neighborhoods have also become less affordable. And we should also interrogate the idea that at the same time the design, planning, and public health community might denigrate the suburb is also a time where suburbs are becoming more racially and economically heterogeneous, which is a far cry from the kinds of suburbs that were described 30 years ago in Suburban Nation. Moreover, we need to, 20 years ago in Suburban Nation. Moreover, we need to rethink the idea in the United States that where we live is a free choice, or that it always reflects one's moral fortitude or their desire to be healthy. But unfortunately, this is sadly appropriate for a country that often conflates wellness with personal responsibility. Which brings us to our current moment. I actually turned in the manuscript for this book just before the pandemic reached the United States. I turned it in February 2020. It got held up in the publishing for a while. Luckily, they have given me it back to me to write a COVID coda. What I found interesting, though, when I was considering what we've seen in the past year, or really the moment that we've in right now, is that COVID-19 sort of takes all these anxieties of the past 150 years that I've just talked about. And in fact, for many of us, it's felt like we've seen a century pass in the past year. We do know that the built environment provides opportunities for, and it presents risks to health. And our conception of healthy places changes with medical knowledge and different pandemics. And again, our medical knowledge of COVID-19 has changed just over the past year. And so what we see is that they've all become urgent again. Now we know that COVID-19 is in the air, giving some credence to miasma theory. But everybody remembers in the beginning of the pandemic, we were wiping down surfaces in our groceries and quarantining our mail, that fear of germs. And as we all know, we've certainly changed our behavior to socially distance and quarantine and wear masks. At the same time, many of the ways past epidemics were addressed in the urban environment have also proven to be consistent to today's pandemic. We know that green space is essential, sanitation is key, and the design of where we live is crucial. And so how I wanted to conclude today is not really talk about how design might change as a result of coronavirus, and hopefully nothing that we see here becomes the permanent condition. But instead, I wanted to just offer a small cautionary tale of these past examples. And that is, there is another consistency between everything I've talked about today. Every epidemic, and also its most guided of built environment cures, often affects immigrants and communities of color first and most disastrously. And we know, as Addie put it in the beginning, this is a country that's founded on the removal of its indigenous people, who were first decimated by the epidemics that were brought by colonizers, and then were systematically forcibly moved off the land they had stewarded for decades, while settlers celebrated their unspoiled quality and built resorts and cabins there for their own health instead. This painting by Thomas Cole celebrates the American landscape that we often associate with health, with fresh air and fresh water, devoid of man's pollution. But it sublimates the solitary figure of a Native American man, hidden in the bottom foreground of the picture, the absence of his tribe speaking as much as his hidden presence. In this cartoon from Puck magazine, drawn around the time of the cholera epidemic, cholera is conflated with newcomers, and the title of this cartoon was called "The Kind of Assisted Immigrant We Cannot Afford to Admit." Cholera, of course, being shown in vaguely Middle Eastern clothing. Instead of taking consideration of the poor as a population most vulnerable to the disease, they were instead blamed for spreading contagion. And often immigrants and communities of color have been systematically removed and quarantined, whether it is physically, economically, or socially, and been subjected to architectural experiments, as we saw in mid-century public housing, that were built on narratives and metaphor rather than epidemiology or backed by policy. And health has also been used very explicitly to discriminate or exclude groups. In 1922, a housing covenant for Silver Spring, Maryland read, "For the purposes of sanitation and health, no owner will sell or lease the said land of anyone of a race whose death rate is at a higher percentage than the white race." Germ theory in the language of quarantine was extensively used in Baltimore's residential segregation ordinance of 1910, which kept Black families from moving onto blocks that had a white majority of residents. Even though they have been denied access, healthcare access for years before, as well as neighborhood improvements. And I would be, of course, remiss not to connect the events of our current moment to the events of the past in places like San Francisco, Chinatown, where disease was used as a justification for the Department of Public Health to repeatedly raid and control the neighborhood's boundaries, and how they used medical inspections and largely fabricated health assessments on the Angel Island immigration station to keep Chinese out of the city altogether. We have to consider how health has been used to exclude groups from desirable landscapes and continues to conscribe them to landscapes of risk instead. A recent study from a group of University of California researchers argued that we need to reckon with how our social practice has had long-lasting physiological effects. By overlaying mortgage companies' redlining maps with health data, they not only found that these neighborhoods were still largely occupied by Blacks and immigrants, but that there remained a plethora of environmental hazards from air pollution to high lead content in soil, resulting in, among other disparities in health, a 3 times higher asthma rate in Black populations than whites. And we also know the effects of climate change, fires, flooding, and urban heat islands will also disproportionately affect communities of color, who are often bereft of urban tree canopies or green space to mitigate them. And we must also keep in mind that the most celebrated healthy landscape, Central Park, which was designed by a revered landscape architect, indeed an abolitionist and a former public health officer, who was not responsible for its land acquisition, but this history has often gone unmentioned. In fact, it was built on the ruins of Seneca Village, which was a thriving African-American settlement that was nonetheless written up as a squatter's camp, squalid and pestilent in the popular press, to advocate for its removal to build the park. And so I would encourage us that instead of thinking about decontamination rooms or plexiglass desks, let us ask ourselves about the conditions that cause these urban heat islands and air pollution disproportionately in Black neighborhoods, which have now proven to be underlying causes for COVID-19 mortality. Instead of worrying about the conception of a very specific type of walkable and bikeable density that has dominated urban design discourse for the past couple decades, can we address the crowded housing of frontline workers who cannot afford to quarantine or access green space from their apartment buildings? In the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked by numerous outlets if the high rates in New York and Boston signaled the end of cities. And I think that fear has mostly abated now. But I wonder why we're not talking about our suburban and our rural places that also saw the same sorts of ruinous spread of the pandemic. We need to think about the places that lie in the margins or even the suburbs and ask ourselves what it is about these environments that has also accelerated the rate of infection. So most of all, we know that the environment does not cause or cure disease, but it is still a key factor in providing opportunities for health or creating the risk for debilitating illness. The landscapes we inhabit embed themselves in our bones and organs. Some of these pathways we know, and some we still do not. In her essay, Shifting Sites, landscape architect Christina Hill discussed how in culture and in ecological science, we have long viewed our skins as a boundary between us and the natural world. But rather, our skins are permeable to energy, to materials, to organisms. And as we now know the burdens of an inequitable social and health system, allowing some to accumulate illness, but it also has the opportunity to build resiliency over generations. And so, as we endure our current crisis, and luckily we seem to be coming out of it at the moment, but we also need to understand that there are likely others ahead of us. Let us take what we've learned from history and shape a healthier future for all. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was extraordinary. I would love to consume the rest of your afternoon myself, but that is not my luxury. I really want to open this up to questions because I think that there's a group of us that have been thinking about this, like I said in the start, for a year. But a lot of folks are just settling and grounding with this for the first time. And there are some brilliant minds on here. I know that some folks have been writing in the chat. But I do want to open it up to questions. I think most of you can unmute yourselves, actually. If you need me to unmute you, let me know. Yes, no. Okay, let's see. Here, let's see. I wonder how much the overemphasis of the urban context of the pandemic is because it is easy to capture in a photograph. It's easy to photograph a city block, but not a rural county to tell a quick narrative. That's from Alice Mount, or Alice Mount, sorry, Alice. And if you do want to be unmuted, just let me know. Great.
Yeah, I think the image of this city, I mean, it's something else I was thinking about, when I would, in the beginning of the pandemic, where somebody from the New York Times asked me, is this the end of cities? And of course not, right? Cities will always come back, as we know. They go through fallout, and who knows if even this marks the end of cities. But what I did tell her is I think it plays into, and what I tried to talk about here was a century of I don't know, fear of the cities and fear of density. And I think, we operate in a space where we know all the ways cities can be good for our health, or at least I would say, dense and walkable cities, connected places, places for social interaction. But I do think it brought back a lot of those anxieties, especially about density. But something I've been thinking a lot about is, maybe we as architects, landscape architects, and urban planners, how do we nuance that discussion about density? Because, it's still good for many things, most of all public transportation, which I really worry about what happens to the investments in public transportation systems. And I would say not just cities, but how do we extend it to suburbs? How do we think about transport in rural areas? And I mean, I'm from South Dakota, which saw, just ruinous rates of COVID-19 a few months behind cities. And I was like, why is nobody asking me about South Dakota? Like nobody's concerned with the built environment there, but I was terrified for my parents for some time. Luckily they got their second shot last week. So hopefully we get to see them again soon. But yeah, I think we've been very concentrated on cities, and it plays into this history of thinking about an urban, I'd say urban, suburban, rural, we can't say binary, but trinary, right? But there are so many spaces in between them, and how do we take into account those environments as well?
Any questions, folks? This is, I guess my other question too, I mean, as we think, during our roundtables, we were talking about the remote work and the shift that will have then on creating new opportunities. So Ray Gastel spoke 2 weeks ago about just how cities themselves, rethink, reimagine. And if there's a big if, there are a large girth of vacancies as people scale back their headquarters or office spaces, and the potential repurposing, what are the opportunities there?
Yeah, and I've been loath to use the word opportunity for a long time, but we should, considering the tragedy. But let's think about how we rethink things. And I think there's definitely potential there. I think not just office buildings, right, which some people are talking about turning into housing, which is potentially interesting because hopefully we can provide housing that's better connected to the services like we just talked about, so we don't have that transit problem. But I would also think about places of commerce, like stores that have gone permanently to e-commerce. How did those become public places again and again? Even if it's strip malls, in the suburbs, can we think about how to repurpose those parking lots? Can we think about how to rethink them to provide public services as well? And something I think a lot about too is if people are working more at home, will it bring back localism, right? Will people invest more in their neighborhoods because it's become more important to them because they are spending more time at home? And so I know since I'm not commuting to Boston every day now, it's not connected yet, but I've become a lot more for other reasons as well. I've been a lot more interested in local politics, right? And what happens to zoning codes in our town, but also looking at the potential here. And if we're talking about, opportunity in the beginning of the pandemic, I live in a commuter suburb of Boston. And so I live a 5-minute walk from the commuter rail. When nobody was driving to the commuter rail parking lot anymore, the kids were playing in the streets because there were not cars interrupting them, right? Or I would take my kids down to the parking lot to play soccer, like just for a change of pace, but also because there's no cars. There's still no cars there. A year later, we can still do it. So is this an opportunity to really start is this an opportunity for people to start thinking about improving and investing in the places they live?
Sarah, I had a thought as you were just saying, because one of the dots you were connecting was who are the voices who are talking during all these different health moments.
Mm-hmm.
And so right now, the work from home and the decentralizing the office voices, the voices we're hearing are two voices I hear, which is the company owners or the senior management,
Right.
who have very nice houses.
Yes.
And so they're fabulous places to work from.
Mm-hmm.
The other voices we're hearing are all the freelance writers who've always worked from home, who are writing the articles, who have always been sure that work from home was the best situation. And so we're hearing this confluence of the work from home freelancers and the senior management. But what I've watched just in our tiny little group is that the young people are desperate to get back to the office because the office is nicer than their house.
Yeah.
They don't have very nice houses. They've been shut out of the housing market. They are in roommates, they're in small situations, and they're desperate to both be around people and have a better situation that's acoustically better. It has snacks.
Yeah.
And so this idea that for people entering the workforce, the office is a better place than your house is not on the minds of management, who is, of course, aligning with cost cutting, as always.
Yeah.
Dreams of cost cutting. But the idea that if you are someone who this first job is your break out of perhaps, your family is a blue collar family and you're the first person to get an office job.
Mm-hmm.
Well, your home situation probably isn't very conducive. You might have younger siblings, you might have grandparents in your house. You can't work from home in the same way. You can't have a private Zoom meeting. So I think there's this huge inequity that's lurking behind the work from home thing.
Right.
That is being glossed over at the moment because of who's writing the stories, which sounds so similar to what you said.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's predominant. And it's kind of funny, like as now that people are maybe less concerned with the epidemiology, I feel like most of the calls or press requests I get now are about work from home, and it's all authors that are working from home. And I would venture, there's a couple other, populations. I probably glossed it over too much at the end of the talk. But again, what about frontline workers who still have to go into the city or live in the city and have less transportation to get there, less childcare, and have been moved further out of the city because affordability too. And I would even venture to say it's that kind of thinking is also not conducive for those of us with young children. Luckily mine just went back to school and daycare, but I'm in my living room right now, and other talks before this one became pretty familiar with my kids, and needing that space as well. And so, yeah, I definitely do think there's it's predominating the discussion, but it's ultimately a narrow swath of the population, right?
Sarah, you mentioned plexiglass and, asking people not to jump to, certain things that maybe make us feel comfortable. And I'm just curious if you're seeing any trends where you feel like people are really missing the mark and maybe oversimplifying what we're facing, and it might not be best as we're moving forward long-term solutions. So I was just wondering if you had any trends that you were noticing.
I don't know. I mean, I actually I worry that there are long-term solutions where maybe we don't need it, like in terms of plexiglass desks, but I worry we're not investing enough. We're not thinking more holistically about our schools, which is a big thing. Like we're actually not thinking about short-term fixes or long-term fixes for our school, when in fact, there's a lot we could do with school design that would be healthier for our children, even if we're not in a pandemic. I taught a studio at MIT last semester, and we were actually looking at public schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and doing surveys of them and thinking about, how could they be retrofitted for better natural ventilation and outdoor classrooms. What we found were a lot of the schools that were built in the 20s and 30s, so around the Spanish flu pandemic, had operable windows, even if they were painted shut or nailed shut, but they still had the windows at least, right, where you could get in natural ventilation. Whereas those that were built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s did not have windows, right, were highly dependent on recycled HVAC. And the retrofitting would actually take a lot more, but natural ventilation is always good for children. We didn't think about it until 100 years ago, and now we're thinking about it again. And so, can we think more long term? Actually, like where can we apply those long term solutions? I think that's what I'm concerned with. So I'm not sure what will stick. I'm honestly not sure what will stick after all this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
Elaine alum.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's a great talk. I think I mentioned this when I contacted you in email, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the healthy building movement. Specifically, I'm a Well AP, but Fit Well also is another program that's out there,
Right.
and where, just in the bigger picture, how you're seeing that, and I don't know how familiar you are with it or what your thoughts are on those programs.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I'm not accredited for the book. I did write a little bit about the development in Tampa, Florida, which is the first Well AP community development.
Yeah.
I was talking to the landscape architects, Reed Hildebrand, who are luckily located here in Massachusetts. We talked a little bit about the difficulty of transferring building guidelines to the landscapes, which is just a whole other issue. I think it's funny. So I teach a course on designing for health at Northeastern. And one of the things I had my students do was read through Fit Well and read through Well AP. And I didn't want to give an opinion on it. I said, but what do you think about this? And it was helpful for them. And I think it is helpful for a lot of people, especially when we're still making the connections between environments and health. I keep thinking like that is not advocacy that we need to keep making, but it actually is. Like it actually, we do need to make very explicit the connections between built environment and health. And luckily people are interested in it again. And so I think it's a good start because it gives people guidelines through a very complicated process. On the other hand, thinking about how LEED has sort of become an amenity, maybe more than an ethic, I guess I would be concerned of that with Well AP too. And it's not the fault of the people that consulted on it. It's not the fault of the people that have pushed it. Obviously, they saw a business opportunity, but a lot of Well AP is for office buildings, right? So we talk about a narrow swath of the population too. What would well look like for housing, right? And I do know they talk about housing. And Fitwell talks about multifamily housing as well. But it's sort of it's wrapped up in this larger culture that we have in the United States, especially at the corporate level. That we can if we can if we can advertise wellness as an amenity, right, we can charge higher rents. And it's
Yeah.
already happening in Tampa with the well certified community, that the rents for apartments in that district, I think, are like almost 200% above like what the average rental cost of an apartment in Tampa is. And so again, that's not the fault of the people that write or are trying to build buildings healthier and are honestly like interrogating how we make our buildings healthy, but rather it's this larger culture we have in the United States where you can, sort of purchase wellness. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think we've seen a huge spike in interest in it, of course, over this last year. And so, but what I think is going to happen is we're using it as a roadmap and introducing people to it as a tool for what are the right things to do and what are the moves to do to get there. But right, similar to LEED, that these things should be becoming best practice, which over time, the codes came to kind of meet a lot of leads. So hopefully that will start to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like I said, it was really, actually, it was very helpful for my students. I gave it to them in the beginning, and I think it was like super helpful for them to navigate, like, again, the very complex relationship that we have between health and the built environment.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I want to be mindful of everyone's time. It's a little bit after 1, and we said this was going to go an hour. Sarah, I think if you just want to maybe stay a little bit longer, I do recognize some folks have to go.
And I'm happy to put my email in the chat as well. I'm more than happy for people to contact me afterwards too.
And I definitely want to put in a plug for next week as well. It will also be during noon, during a lunch hour. It will conclude this particular series, but by no means is this going away. This is really the kickoff of some pretty extraordinary continued dialogue and action, really, to sort of think, ideate, converse, salon style, etc. So for those that do have to leave at 1, I thank you for coming. And for those that want to stay on, you really have like 9 more minutes to ask. But again, Sarah's email is in there. And then I will also, I'm getting a lot better at putting things on YouTube. So this will be quicker than it has been in the past. And yeah. So any final good, juicy questions?
Or any thoughts from people that are grappling with this right now, maybe in practice? I'm curious. I want to try and keep tabs with the professional community about how they're grappling with it, because ultimately we're all shapers of the built environment.
I wonder too how many of the practitioners can speak to that, knowing they're beholden to clients and clients' fears and needs, and and then how far can you push that? So it's
I think it's especially interesting with the density question, and that's what I always, when we think about, that's going to be I worry that an unfortunate effect of the pandemic is people not being in favor of, say, housing, more housing in their towns and building up, because they'll ask, what about COVID? Like, what if there's what's another pandemic? And so how do we alleviate that fear? Then again, I don't know, it's like Americans tend to have amnesia, and in the space of a year we have a vaccine. And so I just keep thinking about, how do we hold on from like the positive lessons we can learn from this while mitigating those concerns.
Great. Any other questions, folks? You can raise your hand if you want, or otherwise we can conclude for the afternoon. I really am so exceptionally grateful. This is fabulous. And we really do look forward to welcoming you up to Portland when we can gather again.
Yeah, I've never been. I'm a recent transplant to New England. So I was really looking to exploring New England more this year. And then, of course.
Yeah, no,
I can't leave Massachusetts.
No, this is great. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to our
Can't wait to
as well.
meet you all in person.
Okay, great.
Bye.